I'd like to look again at some of the verses that I read earlier, particularly towards the end of the chapter. Jesus' well-known words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." My aim today was to put together a very short message that I hope will be helpful at the end of one year and going into the beginning of another. And I alighted on this passage because it really is my prayer that God, by His Spirit, would speak to us who find ourselves in the position that is similar to those who Jesus originally spoke this to. People who are feeling a sense of weariness, who are carrying various burdens, and who are looking where to go and what hope they might find in the year to come, despite all of that. Tiredness and weariness is something that is inescapable as part of the human condition. And I think often we feel it at the end of one year into another. Particularly in church, our liturgical calendar is structured in such a way where this time of the year is one of our busiest seasons. And I might be speaking very much mostly for myself here and betraying the fact that I look forward to January because it is so much quieter than December. But that rest and that lull is necessary, which is why I often look to take some rather focused rest at the start of January, and I find it quite life-giving. Tiredness is a hard one to beat as well. There are any number of growing autoimmune and medical conditions which have chronic tiredness as a symptom and which are elusive and quite difficult to treat and still poorly understood. And so for many of us, whether it's ourselves or family members and friends, we know something of that, and it's at the forefront of our minds. And we're often asked, well, what do we do with that? How can we create a greater supply of energy so that we can carry on and keep going? And I think where Jesus is a great prophet and where he is prophetic is he hints towards the fact that that might not be the answer. That in our world, which is obsessed with a treadmill approach to life, which looks to increasingly add more demands and busyness, our natural reaction is to go, how can I add more supply so that this can all keep going? And I think Jesus offers us in our culture something that runs contrary to that and is an arresting surprise, where he says, actually, come and find rest in me. So I normally do it a bit differently, but let me go through the sort of biblical bits, if you like, the teaching bit, and then we'll look to apply it to wherever we find ourselves today. The way this statement of Jesus is structured is quite powerful because, firstly, Jesus surprises everyone in his original audience by saying, "Come to me." Now, in the world in which he's preaching and speaking into, the law is supreme, and the law is seen as given by God, who is the mouthpiece. The law is the communication of what he thinks and how he would have people live and worship him. And there is no higher authority to which anyone can appeal than the law of God. And into that, Jesus says something quite radical. He doesn't say come to the law. He doesn't say come to a certain rabbi's interpretation of the law. He says, come to me. And in the verses I read just before that, he's been having a bit of a dialogue with himself and the Father of God, his Father, for the benefit of his audience, saying that he and the Father are one, and they're the same person. It was a huge and a bold and a scandalous claim. But it's one that his audience needed to hear. Because for the longest time, they are those who have had the Hebrew Scriptures, all of the Old Testament, and it has been looking toward a day where God would choose and select someone who would come and fully and finally reveal what God was like to his people. And now Jesus has the boldness to say, come to me. Come directly to me. I'd like to put it to you that this is the supreme gift and power of what we celebrate when we come to worship here this morning. There was a Dutch theologian by the name of Abraham Kuyper in the 19th century, and he also became Prime Minister of the Netherlands. A very, very gifted scholar and writer and all of that. And he gave a number of lectures to Princeton University in the late 19th century, where he set out his case for why he believed the Protestantism, and particularly Calvinism, now stay with me if you're not much of a Calvinist or if that word puts you off, but why he thought it was a better way to know God than the alternatives. And I'll just quickly parse for you what were the alternatives of his day, because some of them are still relevant. He said that in Catholicism, you have the church mediating between you and God. So if you want to access and know God, you must go through the church. In paganism, the belief sort of that God is nature or in nature and in all things, you have the sense of God is in everything anyway. So there's nothing particularly special or personal about being able to relate to God because it's just there everywhere all the time. And then the other great sort of worldview at the time was Islam. And in Islam, God was so remote and so distant and even perhaps even uninterested in personal relationship and connection that there was no hope of that anyway. And what he said was, it is Calvinism that gives us this idea of God being immediately present within the heart of the sinner and the person. Of God's immediate nearness and presence, with no need for anyone or anything to mediate. And more than that, that shows that this is actually God's desire. And that's, again, scandalous. And sometimes the church doesn't like that because that's hard to control, and that means people. The price you have to pay for that is people running around claiming that God is telling them all sorts of things. And I would still say on balance it's a price worth having because I think it's inherently biblical, and I think it's close to the heart of what Jesus is getting at here. He's inviting anyone and saying, come to me. You don't need to go through the religious authorities. You don't need to be screened. You're invited to come and to know my presence. And who's he inviting? Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. All who are weary and burdened, the world he's in, there's a lot of weary and burdened people. Most folks were trying their best to live out the law of God and the instruction that was therein. And it was becoming harder for them all the time because there was a religious elite, which we know as the Pharisees. We know them because Jesus has a good go at them a lot of the time in the Gospels. But the problem is they were adding more and more layers between the people and God. And so the hoi polloi, the riffraff, it was almost impossible then to keep all the added man-made regulations that were being added. And the Pharisees had such spiritual authority and power that everyone thought if they're saying it, this must be what God wants and what God is like. The language that's used here is used later on in Matthew, can't remember, it's chapter 26, where Jesus says, woe to you Pharisees, for you tie up heavy burdens and put them on the backs of the ordinary people, and you don't lift one finger yourself to help them carry them. And so you can see here that it is the ordinary people weighed down by the great weight of the extra regulations and demands and obligations that have been put on them. And Jesus is cutting through all of that and saying, I'm interested in you. You who are being kept down, kept away from God and the things of God and being made to believe that it's inaccessible to you. I'm speaking to you now directly. Particularly those who are, you're tired of trying to make your way to God. And then what does he offer them? And I will give you rest. And he actually mentions this twice. I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Do you know what he's doing for them? He is, for people who are trying their best to know and to follow God And the best way that they know to do it is think of the law and the prophets, their Hebrew scriptures, their Old Testament. There was a promise that I read in Jeremiah at the start of the service, where if people would come and walk in God's path, that would ultimately and finally give them the rest of God, that what they'd been looking for ever since they were given the promised land, that immediate connection to God and a rest, a deep rest for the soul, being at peace and at one with God, that Jesus is saying to them, you can find this in me. Now, no wonder the Pharisees couldn't stand him, and that would have made them go insane, because it was truly scandalous what he was saying. But what about us? Where does this find us this morning, and where can we find ourselves in that story, and what would Jesus say to us? I think the first group of people, if you like, I've got three, is those who need to find the hope and the security, the peace, the salvation of God in the words of Jesus, maybe for the first time or maybe anew. Those who are tired and weary of trying to find satisfaction anywhere else. Martin Luther wrote when he first began to see the gospel and when he was beginning the Reformation, he wrote that when he realized that there was nothing he could do to earn God's favor, and that being made righteous or good in God's sight was a passive gift to be received. He's got this lovely phrase. He says, I feel as though I had altogether entered through the gates of paradise. And you can almost see the weight coming off his soul as he writes these words. Can I encourage you, and I think this is the cornerstone of the gospel which we have to offer anyone. If you're trying to earn and find God's favor, trying to find peace with God, trying to atone for your sin, trying to make some of the good deeds cancel out the bad deeds, can I bring you back to the center of the gospel where Jesus says not only is none of that helpful, but it's not necessary, because you're invited to come and to find your repose and your rest in him and what he has done. And the good news that none of us could ever possibly be good enough to earn God's favor, but he was, and he gifts that favor to you and I. For those of us who are looking for meaning and purpose, and are finding that the world that we live in, with one crisis after another, is tiring, and we feel jaded, and it can lead towards despair and hopelessness. That God is interested in that tiredness in your soul, and he wants you to find rest and hope and meaning in the creator of the universe. And then I think there's another group that maybe it's relevant to more of us, because think about it, Jesus is speaking to folks who are feeling worn out and probably burned out from trying to do their best for and with God in the society that they're in. And I think there's a lot of us in church life today. We've just been through a fairly rigorous presbytery reorganization and planning system. We are continuing to go into one year after another where our resources and our human resources and people are dwindling, where there is more pressure coming on us to do more with less from presbytery and from the General Assembly and so on, speaking specifically about the Church of Scotland, but it applies more broadly in many of our expressions of church. And we are here in the midst of that in the church, trying to stretch all that out and doing our best. And that makes me tired at times, I don't mind saying to you, so I'm giving you permission to say that that makes you tired as well. And the only way that any of us can keep doing that is by finding our center of gravity and our rest in Jesus, and by taking him up on his invitation here and finding rest in him. And can I say, perhaps even going to him and taking this promise that he has, that he will speak to you and be with you and guide your soul, to see what he would have you do. Because our tendency in our culture is to take on more and to try and do more with less. And some of us are really conscientious and we think, well, that burden ought to fall on me in order to do this. And we see the need and we run towards it. And that describes so many of our personalities. And I'm speaking of myself because it's mostly people with my personality type that are attracted to caregiving roles such as this. And I got a call last week. Somebody asked me that there is I'll show you where the real sharp end of this is in the church. You take the dwindling numbers of the church and the dwindling numbers of Gaelic speakers, and I'm in the middle of them. So I got a call asking, would I lead a Gaelic sermon, some worship, which is something I love, and I love Gaelic, and I'm passionate about it. I'm passionate about the church, and I'd love to see the church and Gaelic flourish. And it was for next January, and I'm now doing, I don't know, I'm not going to count up all the things I'm doing, but I just had to say no. I wanted to do it. My heart was willing, but I only have the same tent of flesh that Jesus had, who had to go away and rest and be in the wilderness and be himself with himself and his Father for a while, and had to be refreshed. And I can't go and meet every need, and you can't go and meet every need. And I think the word to some of us from Jesus this morning is to rediscover that rest of the soul in him, and then to be discerning and find out what we should put our energy and resources into in the coming year. Because if we try and put them into everything, then we'll be like the poor people in this passage, who all will continue to get is weariness and being bogged down. But I think God, in his infinite wisdom, calls us to something a bit more judicious than that, where some things are picked up and some things are let down. And to feel the freedom and the permission of God, because he even gives us imagery for it. If we're in that rest of God and of Jesus, what should it feel like? It should feel light. Now, that doesn't mean it will always feel easy, or that doesn't mean that there won't be any demands. But it should feel like it's commensurate with what we can carry. And I think the church needs to learn that. I think, given the increasing pressure, that's the only way that we're going to have something that's relatively stable and survivable. And can I just say to you that Jesus cares about your soul? Maybe for some of you, maybe that's, there's also the other excess. There's an excess of rest and of kind of idleness, and that's another passage for another day. But maybe that is the question for you, is to come and ask Jesus, well, what could I pick up? Or if the church is a body, what bit can I pick up so that their bit becomes lighter? Do you see? Because it only works when we're all trying to do this. And we're all judiciously asking, well, Jesus, what does your rest look like for me? And what does my calling and what does me trying my best to honor God look like? And I think for a lot of us, that'll look like being more judicious and careful and discerning. Being more unapologetic. Jesus didn't apologize for the things that he couldn't do. He just said, I couldn't do them. I've got to go and I need to be in my Father's house and my business. I need to have the rest that is necessary for me to keep going. There's so much we can learn from the most perfect man, God himself, who walked the earth in flesh like us. And I think the last group that it hopefully addresses for us as we're gathered this morning is those who are wearied, not by the church and not by the work in it, but by life's circumstances. Because it is impossible to spend any time on this earth and not find yourself there at some point. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest, and rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, I want to draw an implication from that for you. And it might have been that what you went through in 2023 was enormous and felt like a bit too much for you at times. And going into 2024, you're wondering if it's just going to be more of the same or if it's going to be any better. One of the most radical things tucked away in this passage is that Jesus promises his yoke to people. You know that a yoke was basically a bar of wood that went across animals in order for them to be able to plow. And we know from studying the ancient world that it was mostly the poor that had this kind of instrumentation and setup. And so what Jesus does is deliberately identifies with those in the lowest class to show them that he's with them, that he's not interested in the temple elite, who are usually quite well off. He's not interested in the Pharisees, who are the most theologically educated. He's interested in you and me, in the ordinary. And more than that, you see, most people would have conceived of that it's right to put a yoke on people. If God is God, he can put whatever he wants on people, and they just have to get on with it. And I think that's sometimes the way we're tempted to think that the circumstances of our life are unfolding. That God is just up there in heaven and he's piling more on us and putting pressure on us, and he's not really there or interested. And God's given us this revelation through Jesus so that we're able to correct that. And so we're able to have hope that it's better than that. Because what Jesus is actually saying is, I'm going to help you carry whatever it is that you're having to plow through. Do you see that? He says it's his yoke, which means he's implicated. He's got to go through it with you as well. And this is the best passage I've ever found that demonstrates that God goes through. Jesus comes alongside and comes through our deepest and darkest and most difficult struggles with us. He's not uninterested. He's not distant, and I'm trying to demonstrate that from the scripture. I'm really not just making that up. That's just not what I want to believe. I think a lot of us know that from experience too, that in some of our darkest hours that we knew that God held us and carried us, despite all evidence to the contrary. And his promise to you is by putting your hope and your trust in him for this another year, that whatever it is that it holds for you, that he will go through it with you and he will help you carry it. Take my yoke upon you, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. May God bless his word to us today. Amen.